Hiya, it's Liam here, and if you like what we do at the podcast, please do consider supporting us from just £1. And if you love the show, from just £3 a month, you get early access on all of our content as well. All the details are in the show notes. With Christmas just around the corner, it's time to dust off those old DVDs, whip up some eggnog, and cozy up on the sofa with your festive favourites. But why do Christmas films resonate so much? Is the genre a bit more important than we like to think? And ultimately, what can Christmas films really tell us about America? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I am joined by an academic who recently completed her PhD at UCL on mid-century Hollywood politics through a case study on Christmas films. Welcome back to the show, now Dr. Vaughn Joy.
Thank you so much for having me, Liam.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you're becoming a bit of a regular on the podcast, so congratulations, your first one as a proper doctor.
Thank you. Thank you. This is the first thing that I have done professionally as Dr. Joy, so this is my debut.
Oh, we are privileged to have you. And of course, we've got you here talking about something that you know a lot about, which is Christmas films. So I guess I realise the question I'm about to ask is probably a lot bigger than it is worthy of just an opening question. But I think we need to understand the Christmas movie as a genre. So how would you define the Christmas movie?
It is a massive question, and I think one that has lots of answers. I have a couple that are my go-tos. So one, a Christmas movie is a movie you watch at Christmas. I think that that's the most important cultural delineation of a Christmas film, because a lot of people like to watch like James Bond or Harry Potter at Christmas time. And while you can say like, oh, there's a Christmas scene in one of them, like they're not like about Christmas, but they're films that people watch at Christmas. And I think that gets kind of sidelines the whole argument of Die Hard, where if you watch it at Christmas, it's a Christmas film, period, done. My other definition of Christmas would include Die Hard. It's a film that is set at Christmas or relies on Christmas for story structure and plot driving, where the plot can't really happen or wouldn't really make sense at another time of year. It's relying on Christmas as a time of year or a holiday, or uses the Christmas spirit in some way to further the plot. So that's the definition that I use in my dissertation.
That's interesting, because I've always had a slightly unpopular opinion that a lot of our favourite Christmas movies are not actually about Christmas. They're just set at Christmas. And I think, as you put it really well just then, in that actually it's if the Christmas spirit drives the story forward, that's what kind of makes it a Christmas film. Because I always use like Home Alone as an example, and even sort of a bit more tenuously sort of Jingle All the Way. The actual narrative is not about Christmas at all. It's about a guy trying to get a toy for his daughter. It's about a kid left at home while his parents go on holiday. That especially could happen at any time of year, and yet it's a Christmas film.
I think you need some sort of element of the timing, the setting, it being Christmas, and that's why they're going on vacation, why it's so weird that he's left at home, that is balanced with the Christmas spirit. It's weird he's at home because it's a time for family. You're supposed to be with your family, and that invoking Christmas in that way automatically imports all of these kind of cultural values and ideals where you're expected to spend the holiday with family. If it was set in July and the family went on vacation and the kid was home alone, it would just be a film about the robbers trying to break in, pretty much. But because he is home at Christmas, we feel more about it. And I think that is the distinction, is that the element of Christmas forces you to feel a different type of way about what is happening with a basic plot.
Yeah. And I guess actually that the perfect example of that is Home Alone itself, because if you just watch Home Alone 3 versus Home Alone 1, it doesn't resonate as
It doesn't
much.
hit the same.
Yeah, yeah. But I feel like also with Christmas films, there's always this kind of natural race against time element that's built into the story, because whether it's two people figuring out that they're madly in love with each other, or a mum getting home in time to see her abandoned son at Christmas, it has to happen by Christmas, right?
Yes. Yeah, the timing element always adds a bit more stress. And I think that works for Christmas films a lot of the time, because it is like a traveling situation so much of the time, or a will they or won't they kind of plot in the rom-coms. And it, again, I think automatically imported by invoking Christmas is that element of stress. The holidays are kind of stressful.
Yeah.
And they do feel like everything has to happen by Christmas Eve, or things don't go right for the holiday. And it's interesting that this has become a whole cultural phenomenon in film to capture those elements of the holiday in structuring stories about these cultural values and, again, ideals and things like that.
Yeah, I think we've sort of focused a little bit on sort of narrative there, but when you look at like this sort of conveyor belt style churn of like Hallmark Christmas movies that come out every year, it feels like narrative is kind of secondary. They just have a fairly template story about a man and a woman who end up falling in love, and that's on the cards from the first second of the film, but it's set to some nice Christmassy backgrounds and maybe a bit of snowy backdrop, and therefore it's a Christmas film, right? But we accept that. We accept that that's a Christmas film. We watch it at Christmas. So it kind of feels like, is there really anything specifically about the narrative that makes a Christmas film, or do we just add some like jingle bells and off we go?
So I think it depends on different types, and this is largely what my dissertation was about. So fun to talk about for me. The holiday romances, they get their story structure a lot of the time. The kind of Christmas film formula is rooted in the 1950s version of Christmas films. And you can draw it back to other romance kind of media in novels and short stories and things centuries ago. But for film specifically, the first time that we get the kind of formulaic romance structure of Christmas films is in the 1950s. And I do hear you that a lot of the time it's just like Christmas is the kind of pop filter on it. Like it's just through this rosy, tinsely kind of lens. And I think that those films really rely a lot more on the Christmas spirit element, the sentimentality, the kind of schmaltzy, Christmassy vibes, and that stressful timing element. Other Christmas films rely on different Christmas tropes, like Dickensian Christmas traditions, where we get the kind of redemption arc, the Scrooge factor, the Grinch, like all of these kind of learning about what Christmas actually means or what it can come to mean. Because I would argue that it does also mean the kind of commercialist side and exploitative side. But it can also and should more mean the kind of human side. Then in other stories, we get like the Santa Claus narrative. And all of these are equally valid Christmas films, especially an American Christmas tradition that is so varied and has so many different influences on it and has adapted and changed over centuries. But those are the three real kind of central Christmas narratives. And then you get more inventive things like Die Hard, like Gremlins, that are crossing different genres with Christmas. So you get action, you get horror, you get superhero Christmas stories like Batman Returns, I think. Is it Returns? One of the Batmans, the Hawkeye series from MCU a couple years ago, you get these like Christmas stories that are mixed with other genres. And that's where you get more inventive kind of things, but they all have central tropes that harken back to like earlier Christmas traditions, this kind of blanketing, streamlined version of an American Christmas across different films.
So, let's talk about that, because this idea of an American Christmas and this idea of this sort of seasonal sentimentality, why is that so powerful, and why does Hollywood love to use it?
It's a great question, and one that a lot of people have weighed in on. So starting with just American Christmas, the kind of preeminent historian on this would be Stephen Nissenbaum. He has a book called Battle for Christmas about 19th century American Christmas and the kind of establishing history of just how it became such a thing in American history. It starts earlier with the Puritans banning. It starts in BC times if we really want to go back. But for American Christmas, we'll start with the Puritans banning Christmas, and then it having this kind of resurgence as religious identities changed in the early 19th century, and immigrant communities bringing their own traditions from their old countries to the US, and diversifying and melding and building all of these new traditions that became so uniquely Americanized versions of immigrant traditions from other places. And then we, of course, have back and forths and all over the place. And Charles Dickens came to the US and met the Mill Girls in Lowell, read their work, and their work heavily influenced him writing A Christmas Carol. Like, we have so much give and take, and Christmas is one of these cultural things that is just so intermingled across traditions and cultures and peoples. And I think that it's incredibly important to American identity, because in the 19th century, it was very much not, and even still today, very much not a religious holiday. There are some ties to Christianity and Christian traditions, but a lot of it is either secular or pagan, or it just comes from local traditions. And throughout the 19th century, it gradually became a public American holiday. It became a federal holiday. It began using patriotic emblems in its kind of expressions and iterations. And then it became fully commercialized. It went from a kind of Christmas bazaars and these smaller Christmas markets that like harken back to German markets and winter festivals, to the Macy's store window at 34th Street. And that development into the commercialized holiday made it just prime for cultural entanglements, we'll say. It being used in these cultural media sources like film. And Hollywood really grasped onto the profitability of Christmas, and then with just like expert precision exploded the profitability of Christmas. And really, really made all of these diverse and disparate ideas and traditions and rituals about Christmas into a streamlined visual. Really, for the first time in the American Christmas tradition, they made all of these things national and then international icons. And that's not to say that Santa Claus was not already an international icon, but the Miracle on 34th Street, 1947 Santa, played by Edmund Gwenn, is the vision that a lot of people have of Santa now.
I would challenge that and say the 1993 Richard Attenborough version of Santa in Miracle on 34th Street is that's the one in my head, I'm afraid. But
right, okay, well, yeah, I guess my references are a bit dated because I studied the post-war. But I do think that for American Christmas traditions, a lot of our ideas and visions of a lot of things about our country, but specifically Christmas, come from this post-war period, come from Miracle on 34th Street, White Christmas in 1954, Babes in Toyland 1961, It's a Wonderful Life 1946. Like, those are the classic visual depictions of Christmas that a lot of us have and hold as like the traditional kind of view of Christmas.
I mean, let's talk about It's a Wonderful Life then, because it's I think it features on every list you'll ever see of the greatest Christmas movies of all time. It's really endured for decades, still repeated on TV every single year. And yet the film itself, in tone, in narrative, it's quite bleak. It's not a conventional kind of schmaltzy Christmas film. So how exactly does something like It's a Wonderful Life endure and be remembered as a Christmas movie?
So this is a fascinating thing that we talked about for a long time in my thesis defense last week. I know a lot of people find it very dark, but I think it's an incredibly uplifting and optimistic film. My view of It's a Wonderful Life is that it's a film about collective national trauma and getting through that trauma. In the film, we see the time frame is between 1909 and 1945, roughly. I think it's Christmas 1945. So we see the Spanish influenza, we see the Great Depression, we see runs on the banks, we see George living through all of these things, World War II. Like, it's a just hit after hit after hit for Americans. And if you're sitting in that audience in 1946, you're like, God, yeah, that was terrible. The last 40 years, we had a little bright spot in the 20s for some of us, not even all of us. And we're still just kind of reeling from it. And what I think It's a Wonderful Life does is this beautiful reminder that Americans still have each other, that you have all gone through it, and you may have lost a lot of people throughout, but you are still here, and the people in the cinema with you watching it are still here, and you are together. And the story is quite depressing if you really focus on George. You see a man who is giving everything that he has got through his whole life, sacrificing constantly, as a lot of these people in the cinema would have done for the last few decades, especially in the last 4 years throughout the war. So much sacrifice and rationing and all of these things. And you feel the weight of all of that. But if you watch it from a collectivist kind of standpoint, throughout the entire film, you see townspeople helping George. Everyone is sacrificing for each other. And we're not really supposed to focus on that. The story's about George, you're looking at George, but it is a very strong element of the film. The first time you see George, he is being gifted a suitcase so that he can go travel. The townspeople are constantly helping one another. And I think that's the uplifting message. If we can get away from looking at the individual and think about the collective, then it is a very uplifting film, in my opinion.
I guess that's a very valid point, and I do wonder on that basis if maybe It's a Wonderful Life does this a bit more impactfully than other Christmas films, but I do wonder if actually maybe we don't give the genre as a whole a bit more credit, because when you kind of peel back the tinsel and kind of look under the surface, are Christmas films actually telling us a bit more than we generally like to acknowledge about America and American life?
Well, I certainly think so. I wrote a very long dissertation about it. But yeah, I really think that they do. And I think that's true for a lot of genres. For any film, it's worth really sitting critically with what you are watching, what depictions you are watching. Is this supposed to be a typical American? There are a lot of questions that you can ask of every film that I think deepen them in many ways. But especially Christmas films, because there are these layers of sentimentality, these centuries of building immigrant traditions into one another, and this gorgeous kind of melding of cultures that became the American Christmas tradition. And when you think about these films in that context of them being part of centuries of just American identities growing and changing and adapting and being influenced by international events or changing international events, you get so much more out of thinking about George. When you just watch It's a Wonderful Life cold on its own, It's a good film, you enjoy it, you probably feel a bit like, oh, that was kind of dark, but at least it ended on a happy note. But when you think about it as an American response, Frank Capra's immigrant story response to A Christmas Carol, it changes everything. You see George as Bob Cratchit, you see Potter as Scrooge without a redemption arc. What does that say about 1946 America as opposed to 1943, I think, London? Like, the fact that Scrooge was redeemed then and Potter never is, he never even has consequences. What does that say about our society? That we don't condemn Scrooges. We just let them go, but tell our townspeople that they should be happy they have each other. What is that kind of message? And I think that we should be playing that little game with all of these Christmas films of like, where does this sit in the very broad and fascinating history of Christmas traditions?
Looking at a film like It's a Wonderful Life in that context of when it was produced, I think is really important in understanding how Christmas films can kind of embed themselves in the canon of the genre, because I feel like there's such a strong element of how much it resonates at the time it's released as well, in terms of how we as a society sort of cling on to it, because it becomes a piece of nostalgia if it resonates at the time. And I would think back to like a British Christmas film like Love Actually. Now it's over 20 years old and there are a lot of quite outdated sort of elements to that, but I think you could watch that back with a sense of nostalgia if you enjoyed it at the time it was released, because it kind of takes you back to that time.
Yeah, and I think that those two actually are a really interesting pairing because they both address national or international traumas. Like Love Actually opens with talking about 9/11, and Richard Curtis in his interviews about Love Actually has said some very beautiful things about the requirement for art to meet the moment and to address the emotional state of the audience and inspire the emotions that you want to see in your audience. Richard Curtis was very, in his words, he was very shaken by 9/11 and the possibilities that it would have for the future. And he made Love Actually as his own kind of therapy to remind people that there is so much hate and fear and threat in the world, but there's also love. And love actually is all around us. Like, it's a very schmaltzy kind of thing, but it's also an incredibly cathartic kind of film for Richard Curtis and a lot of the audience. And I think that people still grasp onto that kind of sentiment in these films. It's a Wonderful Life didn't do too well. It was fine. It had middling success in 46. But it came back into public consciousness in the 70s when it lapsed into public domain, and it was aired kind of constantly on TV in the 70s, and then there was a deal with NBC and it was a whole thing, but it still aired annually. But its constant kind of like showing at Christmas in the 70s, I think, was again like a really cathartic kind of thing for people who still living in the Cold War. It was this like pre-atomic bomb ideal world. They don't really address the bomb in It's a Wonderful Life, so it captures this like earlier kind of sweet townsy like feel that a lot of people could feel safe in.
Yeah.
And I think Love Actually does the same thing. They're both these like, let's cuddle up and remind ourselves that we have each other even when times are really tough.
But do you think that is where the power of Christmas films are? Because again, thinking about Love Actually, it deals with a very big and at the time very controversial issue of the US-UK relationship. And when we're talking about 2003, that was a very contentious issue, with everything that was happening in Iraq. And yet, a film like Love Actually is able to take this huge thing and wrap it up in a way that's actually quite palatable and quite processable by mass audiences. But it's actually saying a lot about that whole thing. I feel like Christmas kind of has that ability to sort of do that and sort of make these quite uncomfortable things feel a bit more manageable.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And that'll take us back to something that Stephen Nissenbaum, the historian that I mentioned earlier about the 19th century, something he says in his prologue to Battle for Christmas, which I think is just one of the best encapsulations of what American Christmas is. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says ultimately that the kind of rituals and traditions that we have around Christmas have this magical kind of behavior to expose what we have been, what we are at the moment, and what we are becoming despite ourselves. And I think it's such a beautiful idea that Christmas is kind of this like math equation. How we act at Christmas minus who we are the rest of the year is who we actually are. Like it's who we want to be. And you can use Christmas as this idealizing factor of like, we're not that great at the moment, but we could be. And this is our best version of ourselves because it's Christmas, like wrapped in that kind of tinsel. Or you can use it as a social mirror and say, we're doing some awful things like Dickens does with A Christmas Carol. And like, we need to change using that kind of tripartite, temporal, past, present, future idea. Or you can like, Christmas is this vehicle to have a very harsh look at who you are as a nation or a person or a locality, and to make a decision about who you want to be the rest of the year. And I think that's why Christmas films have this power to confront issues like US-UK relations or national trauma of World War II and the Great Depression, or the Dickensian exploitation and monopolization of resources. They can do that with this sheen of not really moralizing in a patronizing way, but moralizing in an ambitious way of we can do better and we probably should.
I feel like when we've spoken on the podcast before, every time, we've chatted about the Oscars, we've chatted about Barbie, now we're chatting about Christmas films, and every time we touch on this idea of, art imitating life, life imitating art. And I just wonder how that plays out with Christmas films. Is there almost a sense that Hollywood creates an almost aspirational element to Christmas and how it should be celebrated, which is then adopted by us in real life? Or is Hollywood simply reflecting back how we celebrate Christmas? Or is there this bit of tug of war between the two going on?
I think it's a tug of war. I think it's give and take. Sometimes it's a reflection, sometimes it's a call to action. There's a 1947 Christmas film called It Happened on Fifth Avenue by Roy DeLuth, which is one of the ones in my dissertation. And very early in the film, a veteran is being evicted from his apartment in order to make a skyscraper of expensive condos, whatever. And he says, while he's being carried out by police, that they're in violation of some law, some code, whatever. And he cites the number. And the police say there is no such legislation against evicting veterans. And he says, well, there ought to be. For a Hollywood film to be calling for legislation to protect veterans and provide them housing, like that's a hell of a thing to put into a Christmas film.
Yeah.
To put into any film, to say we need Congress to act because this is a very real issue that's happening. And in 1949, we do get a Housing Act. And I'm not saying that it happened on Fifth Avenue caused the Housing Act to happen, but it was part of that movement. It was part of that cultural moment and social moment to protect veterans. So I think Hollywood can definitely be used as a call to action, but then it can also reflect certain things, like It's a Wonderful Life, reflecting the kind of national trauma, and same with Love Actually, of reflecting the emotional state of the moment and making some sort of narrative and message about it that either, like, things are pretty bleak, but we will get through, or things are bleak and we should do something about it, like Hugh Grant in Love Actually. We should, yeah.
I mean, it's almost like there's something just very unifying about Christmas in, whether everyone's feeling happy, whether everyone's feeling sad, whether everyone's feeling scared, we can do that together.
Yeah.
And Christmas is a chance. And I feel like where, in real life, we do that as families, we do that as friendship groups. Hollywood and Christmas films have a way of then putting that on the national stage and making us all collectively feel like we're kind of in this together or celebrating Christmas together.
Yeah, I really think so. And I think another point that Christmas films really excel at is finding a kind of most common denominator Christmas experience. I think a really great example for that is A Christmas Story from 1983. A lot of us, especially Americans growing up in the 20th century, have a memory of sitting on a mall Santa's lap or a department store Santa's lap, as in Miracle, or wanting a specific toy that we weren't really supposed to want, or like there are certain like experiences at Christmas that, when invoked, you have an emotional connection with the film, and you can be like, oh, I remember when I was a kid and I like really wanted to sit on Santa's lap, but the line was too long and we couldn't. It ruined Christmas. Like there are these kind of like just Christmas moments that get the audience emotionally invested in a way that doesn't really happen in a lot of other genres. You can't really picture yourself as like Chris Evans in some action film or something, but you can picture yourself as little Ralphie wanting the rifle, or like laughing at a friend who got stuck in the snow or something. Like, like there are these kind of nostalgic elements to a lot of Christmas films where you can place yourself in the film. And that sentimentality means all that much more. And you can take on the messages of these films in a much more personal, invested kind of way.
Do you think maybe that's why the question of whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie is contentious? Because there is that element of, we can't all necessarily relate to Bruce Willis going around kind of shooting up all the bad guys. But it still has that Christmas element. There's still very much a lot of the things that we've just been discussing. But like on the face of it, it is an action movie and kind of lacks that bit of relatability that we expect.
That is an excellent question. And the first actual dispute of Die Hard not being a Christmas film that I've ever really considered, or been intrigued by. I think that's a really, really excellent point of, is relatability something that a Christmas film needs to have? I don't know. I personally don't think it does. I'm feeling this out as I'm talking, though, so let me think. I don't think it does. I think that might be why some people don't relate to it and say it's not a Christmas film, because it isn't that kind of schmaltzy, like, sentimentality that they can get behind or get invested in any sort of way. And some people just don't like action films. I don't like horror films, but I would still say that Gremlins is a Christmas film.
Yeah.
But yeah, that might be part of the kind of issue for some people.
Yeah.
To call it a Christmas film. And also, I think it's absolutely fine if people don't think it's a Christmas film, because I think that your personal definition of a Christmas film is what a Christmas film is, and it's not something that you have to argue with strangers on the internet.
Fair enough. Very, very fair point. So putting that one aside for a second,
Yes.
I do want to just come back to the real question of the episode, and just wonder, with everything we've discussed, what do you think ultimately Christmas films can tell us about America?
So, in a very broad sense, I think they can tell us a lot about the political, social, cultural, and economic moments in which they were made. When you place it temporally, it will reflect a lot about the contemporary society and how the mainstream Christmas was celebrated in that period, and what that then says about all of those other elements of society, cultural, social, economic, and whatnot. In a more specific sense, for each individual film or each era, I think that they give us a broad arc of American identity. They tell us whose Christmas traditions are the mainstream and what kind of things were important in that moment. And again, we keep coming back to it, but I think the catharsis of It's a Wonderful Life and Love Actually, and even to an extent the nostalgic catharsis of A Christmas Story, harkening back to 1940, a definitely pre-war, pre-atomic bomb American suburb kind of nostalgia. Like those things really tell us a lot about what needs people had, what kind of escapist needs, all of those kinds of things. But then you also get films of like Scrooged and the George C. Scott Christmas Carol that echo the kind of conservative reality of the 1980s. Like they tell us a lot. They tell us a lot. That's my answer.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think there's a lot that we can discuss about
Yes.
Christmas films specifically, and how ultimately that kind of reflects um, American society back at us. And certainly, as someone who isn't American and doesn't live in America, I think it is really interesting to see Hollywood Christmas films and how much that I also gravitate towards Hollywood films as a Brit. That there must be something a lot more universal in Christmas movies than perhaps other genres. But I think that's one to bookmark for next year because, of course, we're going to have to talk about this again next Christmas. But
Absolutely.
for now, Vaughn, thank you so much once again for joining me on the podcast. And for anyone listening, if you've liked what we've chatted about, we'll put some links in the show notes to some other stuff that you can enjoy and read and watch, etc. But Vaughn, if anyone wants to connect with you specifically, where can they do that?
I am on Blue Sky at G Vaughn Joy, and then whatever dot B Sky Social or something. Or I am on Substack with a newsletter called Review Roulette. Yeah, you can find me in those two places.
Awesome. Yes, we'll link to Review Roulette as well in the show notes for you. And yeah, all about Blue Sky. Find me on there as well. And I am still on X, but I'm going to be honest, I don't use that very much anymore. And on LinkedIn as well. So just search for my name and you'll find me as well. If you enjoy the podcast, do just take 10 seconds out of your day to leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this, and give us a follow as well so that all future episodes appear in your feed as well. And we're also going to leave some links in the show notes so you can support the show from as little as $1. That really helps us out, keeps us making it, and makes us very happy indeed. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. And if you enjoy this and want more, remember you can support the show from as little as £1. All the details are in the show notes.